The physician made his final house call in March 1877. What he found in Margaret Burchard's recovering body contradicted everything in his medical training, and the secret he'd kept through that terrible winter would haunt his practice for decades. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time it is right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now let's continue with the story. The leather-bound journal sat in a storage box at the Rutland County Historical Society for 47 years before anyone opened it. When librarian Dorothy Keene finally opened it in 1923, she found the careful handwriting of Dr. Edwin Traverse, a rural Vermont physician who'd practiced medicine in the decades following the Civil War. Most entries documented routine cases: broken bones set in farmhouse kitchens, fevers treated with quinine, childbirths attended in the hours before dawn. But the entries from November 1876 through March 1877 told a different story entirely. Traverse had written these passages in cramped, almost frantic handwriting that contrasted sharply with his usual careful penmanship. Some sentences were crossed out, then rewritten. Others trailed off mid-thought, as if he couldn't bring himself to complete them. Dorothy found herself reading the same passages multiple times, certain she'd misunderstood what the doctor was describing. She hadn't. The case involved a young bride named Margaret Howell Burchard, 18 years old at the time of her marriage in February 1876. County records confirmed the wedding, listing her father as a local merchant and her husband Samuel as the owner of a 60-acre farm 3 miles outside Rutland proper. The property deed showed Samuel had purchased the land just months before the marriage, suggesting a young couple starting their life together with reasonable prospects. Margaret's first pregnancy came quickly. Traverse's journal noted her condition in April, recording that she appeared healthy and strong despite her youth. The birth in August should have been routine, but something went catastrophically wrong in that farmhouse bedroom. Something that left Margaret hemorrhaging for hours while Traverse worked desperately to save both mother and child. The baby survived. Margaret technically did too, but what remained was hardly recognizable as the vibrant young woman who'd married 6 months earlier. Traverse's clinical notes from late August described a patient so pale her skin appeared see-through, unable to stand without fainting, her pulse barely detectable at her wrist. She'd lost more blood than he'd ever seen anyone lose and survive. And in 1876 rural Vermont, there was almost nothing he could do about it. The journal entries grew darker through September and October. Iron supplements made no measurable difference. Beef tea, the standard treatment for building strength, provided barely any improvement. Margaret grew weaker by the week, her body unable to replace what had drained away during those hours of hemorrhaging. Traverse noted her temperature dropping, her breathing becoming more labored, her moments of consciousness growing fewer. By late October, he'd privately concluded she wouldn't survive the winter. The wedding photograph survived in the Burchard family estate papers, now housed at the Vermont Historical Society. Margaret stands beside Samuel in her best dress, her posture straight, her expression carrying that mix of nervousness and hope common to young brides of her era. Nothing in the image suggests what would unfold in the months ahead. The ceremony took place on February 14, 1876, at the Methodist Church in Rutland. The marriage certificate lists Margaret's age as 18 years and 3 months, Samuel's as 22. Her father, Thomas Howell, signed as witness alongside Samuel's brother Jacob. The church registry notes a modest gathering appropriate for a merchant's daughter marrying a young farmer with decent prospects but limited means. Samuel had worked 3 years to save enough for the farm purchase. The deed, dated November 1875, describes 60 acres of mixed woodland and pasture with a 2-story farmhouse, a barn adequate for dairy cattle, and a spring-fed well. Property tax records show he paid in full, suggesting careful planning rather than impulsive romance. This was a man who prepared for the future, who valued stability and self-sufficiency. Margaret moved into the farmhouse a week after the wedding. Letters to her sister Elizabeth, preserved in family correspondence, describe her initial months with cautious optimism. She wrote about learning to manage a larger household, about helping with the early spring planting, about her growing comfort with farm routines. The letters carry the voice of a young woman adjusting to adult responsibilities but facing them willingly. Her pregnancy became apparent in April. Traverse's first examination, recorded in his journal on April 23, found everything normal. Margaret's health seemed robust. She continued her household work through early summer, her letters to Elizabeth mentioning fatigue but nothing alarming. The doctor noted during a June visit that she appeared strong for a first pregnancy, her color good, her spirits high. August brought the labor that changed everything. Traverse arrived at the farmhouse on the morning of August 9th, summoned by Samuel shortly after dawn. The birth proceeded normally at first. His journal described standard progression through the early stages, Margaret bearing the pain with what he termed admirable strength. By afternoon, the child had crowned. By early evening, a healthy boy had entered the world. Then the bleeding began. Traverse's entries become clinical and detailed, describing hemorrhaging that exceeded normal postpartum blood loss within the first hour. He applied standard interventions, ergot preparations to contract the uterus, cold compresses, elevation of the lower body. Nothing slowed the flow adequately. His handwriting in these passages remains steady, the words of a professional documenting a crisis. But the underlying desperation seeps through. The bleeding continued for 6 hours. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness. Samuel held their newborn son in the hallway outside the bedroom, waiting for word his wife would survive. Travers wrote that he'd never felt more helpless, watching a patient slip away while possessing no adequate tools to stop it. The hemorrhaging finally ceased near midnight, but the damage was catastrophic. Travers estimated Margaret had lost more than half her blood volume, a calculation that seemed impossible given her survival. She lay motionless in the bed, her breathing shallow, her skin the color of old parchment. When he checked her pulse, he could barely detect it. The following days brought no improvement. Margaret couldn't sit upright without fainting. She lacked strength to hold her infant son. Solid food made her nauseated. Her body temperature ran below normal. Travers visited daily through late August, documenting a patient trapped in a slow decline with no clear path to recovery. By September, he had begun preparing Samuel for the likelihood of becoming a widower before harvest season ended. The young farmer received this news in silence, then asked what treatments might still be attempted. Travers could offer nothing beyond what he'd already tried. Medical science in 1876 had reached its limits in that farmhouse bedroom. Margaret was dying and everyone knew it. Dr. Travers's journal entries from September and October 1876 read like a catalogue of medical failure. Each attempted treatment carefully documented, each failure carefully recorded. The pages reveal a physician confronting the brutal limitations of his profession in an era when good intentions meant almost nothing without effective remedies. Iron supplements represented the standard treatment for what physicians then called severe anemia. Travers prescribed ferrous sulfate tablets obtained from the apothecary in Rutland at considerable expense. Margaret took them faithfully 3 times daily with meals. After 2 weeks, Travers could detect no measurable improvement. Her paleness remained unchanged. Her weakness persisted. The iron passed through her system without apparent benefit, as if her body had lost the ability to process it. Beef tea came next, a concentrated broth believed to restore vitality through its richness. Samuel prepared it according to Travers's precise instructions, simmering beef for hours to extract maximum nutrients. Margaret managed small amounts, though larger servings caused nausea. The doctor's notes from late September show marginal gains. She could occasionally sit propped against pillows for short periods, but sitting upright for more than 10 minutes left her exhausted for hours afterward. Travers considered every option available to rural medical practice. He prescribed cod liver oil for its supposed strengthening properties. Margaret couldn't keep it down. He suggested porter, a dark beer sometimes given to nursing mothers and weakened patients. It provided no noticeable benefit. He tried various tonic preparations advertised in medical journals, combinations of herbs and minerals promising restoration of vitality. Nothing worked. The nearest hospital with any capacity for advanced treatment stood in Boston, 3 days' travel by train and carriage. Travers broached his possibility with Samuel in early October, though his journal reveals he considered it more gesture than genuine option. Margaret lacked strength for such a journey. She could barely tolerate being moved from bed to chair. The trip itself would likely prove fatal. Even if she survived the travel, Travers privately doubted Boston physicians could offer anything beyond what he'd already attempted. Blood transfusion existed in theory, mentioned in European medical literature with mixed results. Most attempts ended in the patient's death from reactions physicians couldn't predict or prevent. No doctor would risk such an experimental procedure on someone already this weakened. His October entries grow increasingly somber. Margaret's pulse continued weakening. Her breathing required visible effort. The brief periods of alertness she'd maintained through September grew fewer. Some days she barely opened her eyes. Her infant son, healthy and growing, nursed from a wet nurse Samuel had hired from a neighboring farm. Margaret lacked even strength enough to hold the child. Travers began timing his visits to coincide with her rare moments of consciousness. During one such visit in mid-October, she asked him directly whether she would recover. His journal records the conversation in detail. He told her truthfully that he saw no medical path to improvement, that her body seemed unable to replace what had been lost, that every treatment had failed to change her deteriorating condition. She thanked him for his honesty, then asked how long she had. Weeks, he told her. Perhaps a month if fortune favored her. She nodded slightly, the gesture clearly exhausting, and asked him to ensure Samuel wouldn't blame himself. The request struck Travers as heartbreaking. This dying young woman more concerned with her husband's emotional burden than her own approaching death. He left the farmhouse that day believing he would soon be signing a death certificate. His journal entry concludes with an admission that still resonates across the decades. I have never felt more useless in my profession than I do in the presence of Margaret Burchard. She is dying and I can do nothing but watch. 3 weeks later, everything would change in ways he could never have imagined. Among the Burchard estate papers, researchers found a collection of letters Samuel had written but never sent. The envelopes remained sealed, addresses written in his careful hand, stamps affixed but never cancelled. He'd composed them during October 1876, each one a desperate reach toward knowledge that might save his dying wife. The first letter, dated October 7th, was addressed to Dr. Charles Hewitt at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Samuel's writing shows none of the emotional desperation one might expect. Instead, he presents Margaret's case with clinical precision, describing her symptoms, listing the failed treatments, asking whether any new procedures might offer hope. He mentions having read about blood transfusion in a medical journal obtained from the Rutland Library, wondering if such an intervention might be attempted. Dr. Hewitt never received the letter. Samuel apparently reconsidered sending it, perhaps recognizing that no Boston physician would travel to rural Vermont for an experimental procedure on a dying patient they'd never met. The second letter, dated October 12th, went to a medical supply company in New York. Samuel inquired about purchasing transfusion equipment, describing what he'd seen illustrated in journal articles: rubber tubing, needles, collection vessels. The company's catalog found with the letter shows no such items available for private purchase. Transfusion technology remained confined to experimental hospital settings, certainly not accessible to farmers in Vermont. But it was Samuel's private diary, discovered in a separate box, that revealed the true depth of his research. The entries from mid-October show him spending hours in the Rutland Public Library reading every medical journal and textbook available. He copied passages about blood, about anemia, about experimental treatments being discussed in European medical circles. His handwriting fills pages with notes about successful animal-to-animal transfusions, about theories of blood replacement, about the vital properties physicians believed blood carried. One passage he copied repeatedly comes from a French medical text describing experiments with dogs. Researchers had successfully transferred blood between animals by direct connection of their circulatory systems. The dogs receiving blood showed immediate improvement. Those giving blood suffered no lasting harm. The procedure worked reliably enough that some European physicians were beginning to attempt it with human patients. Samuel understood the risks. His diary includes copied accounts of failed human transfusions, patients dying within hours from mysterious reactions, blood clotting before it could be transferred, infections following the procedures. The success rate barely reached 20%. Most physicians considered it too dangerous to attempt outside of the most desperate circumstances. His circumstances were exactly that desperate. But Samuel's research led him down an unexpected path. In a British medical journal from 1874, he found a brief mention of a different approach entirely. A physician treating severe anemia in remote regions where transfusion equipment didn't exist had experimented with having patients consume small amounts of fresh blood as a dietary supplement. The theory suggested that blood taken orally might provide nutrients unavailable from conventional food, particularly iron in a form the body could more readily absorb. The article offered no definitive conclusions. The physician reported some patients showed improvement, others did not. Sample sizes were too small for scientific certainty. The practice bordered on the barbaric, even the author acknowledged. Yet in cases where no other treatment existed, where death appeared inevitable, perhaps such desperate measures warranted consideration. Samuel's diary entry from October 20th shows him grappling with this possibility. He wrote about the revulsion he felt at the idea, about the social and moral boundaries it would cross, about what people would think if they knew. But he also wrote about watching Margaret fade day by day, about their infant son who would grow up without a mother, about the helplessness of standing by while she died. The final entry from that week consists of a single sentence. If it could work, if there is any chance at all, how can I not try? He never wrote to Dr. Traverse about what he was planning. That conversation would come later under very different circumstances. Dr. Traverse recorded the confrontation in his journal with the careful detail of a man documenting something he knew history would judge harshly. The date was November 3rd, 1876. Samuel had requested the meeting, asking the doctor to call at the farmhouse in the evening after his regular rounds. The unusual timing should have warned Traverse that something significant was coming. Samuel met him at the door, ushered him into the parlor rather than upstairs to Margaret's room. The young farmer's appearance had deteriorated over the preceding weeks. Traverse noted shadows under his eyes, weight loss visible in his face, the look of a man carrying an unbearable burden. They sat across from each other in straight, back chairs as November darkness settled outside the windows. What Samuel proposed took several minutes to explain. Traverse's journal captures his own initial incomprehension, then growing horror as he understood what the younger man was suggesting. Not transfusion, which at least had some precedent in medical literature, but something far more primitive and disturbing. Samuel wanted to provide Margaret with his own blood as a dietary supplement. Small amounts, he emphasized, administered orally twice daily. He'd researched the approach in medical journals, found references to similar attempts in remote regions. The theory held that fresh blood contained vital elements in forms more accessible than conventional food. Elements that might restore what Margaret's body had lost and couldn't replace through normal means. Traverse's response, recorded in both his journal and referenced in Samuel's diary, was immediate rejection. He cited medical ethics, professional standards, the complete lack of scientific evidence supporting such a practice. He pointed out the profound psychological harm it might cause, the revulsion Margaret would feel, the way it violated every social and moral boundary of civilized behavior. The idea belonged in medieval superstition, not 19th century medical practice. Samuel listened without interruption, then asked a single question: "What alternative do you offer?" The question hung in the parlor air. Traverse had no answer. Every conventional treatment had failed. Margaret was dying. He'd already told Samuel that death was inevitable, that medical science could do nothing more. Now Samuel was proposing something outside medical science entirely, and Traverse found himself confronting an impossible position. If he reported Samuel to authorities, the young farmer would likely face commitment to an asylum for insanity. Margaret would die alone. Their infant son would become an orphan. If he simply refused and walked away, the outcome would be the same. But if he stayed silent, if he allowed this to proceed, he became complicit in something that defied every principle of his profession. Samuel made his case methodically. He wasn't asking Traverse to participate or endorse the treatment. He was simply informing the doctor of his intention, seeking neither permission nor approval. Margaret was his wife. The decision was his to make. He would proceed regardless of Traverse's opinion. The only question was whether the doctor would continue monitoring her condition or abandon her entirely. Traverse's journal shows him struggling with this ultimatum. He argued that the treatment might cause harm, that Margaret's weakened system could react badly, that introducing blood into her digestive system might trigger dangerous complications. Samuel countered that she was dying anyway, that any risk paled beside the certainty of her current trajectory, that doing something carried more hope than doing nothing. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Traverse tried every argument he could summon. Samuel remained unmoved. Finally, near midnight, the doctor asked whether Margaret had consented to this plan. Samuel's response appears in both men's accounts. She had agreed, understanding it represented her only remaining chance at survival. Traverse left the farmhouse that night without giving Samuel a clear answer. His journal entry concludes with a paragraph that reveals his internal conflict. I cannot in good conscience approve what he proposes to do. Yet I cannot in good conscience abandon a dying patient because her husband wishes to try something unconventional. I am caught between professional ethics and human compassion, and I do not know which should prevail. He would make his decision within days, forced by circumstances neither man anticipated. Samuel's diary entry from November 21, 1876, begins with a simple statement, I started today. He'd waited nearly 3 weeks after his conversation with Traverse, perhaps hoping the doctor would return with an alternative solution. None came. Margaret continued weakening. By late November, she remained conscious only a few hours each day. Samuel made his decision. His diary describes the process with clinical detachment, as if emotional distance might make it more acceptable. He used a small lancet purchased from the apothecary, sterilized according to the basic antiseptic principles he'd read about. The procedure took place in the kitchen, not Margaret's bedroom, maintaining some separation between the act and her immediate presence. He collected small quantities in a clean glass, mixed them immediately with red wine to mask the taste and texture, then brought the mixture upstairs. Margaret drank it without comment. Samuel's diary notes her expression remained neutral, neither revulsion nor hope visible in her face. She was too weak for strong reactions. She simply consumed what he offered, then lay back against her pillows. He recorded no conversation between them about what had just occurred. Perhaps there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been discussed when she'd agreed to try this desperate measure. He repeated the procedure that evening and again the following morning. Twice daily as he'd planned, small amounts each time, no more than a few spoonfuls. Samuel's entries become repetitive through late November, documenting the routine without elaboration, administered treatment at dawn and dusk. Margaret tolerates it without difficulty. No visible change in her condition. Dr. Traverse discovered what was happening during an unannounced house call on December 2nd. His journal entry from that day opens with a single word, underlined twice, horror. He'd arrived at the farmhouse in late morning, intending to check on Margaret's deteriorating condition. Samuel wasn't expecting him. The young farmer stood in the kitchen with the lancet in his hand, fresh wine in a glass beside him. Traverse understood immediately what he was witnessing. His journal describes a moment of frozen silence. Neither man moving, both aware they'd reached a point where everything would change. Samuel broke the silence by asking if Traverse wanted to examine Margaret. The doctor followed him upstairs, his mind still processing what he'd seen below. Margaret lay propped against pillows as usual, but something about her appearance struck him differently. Her color seemed marginally improved, perhaps not healthy by any measure, but less death pale than during his previous visit. Her eyes, when she opened them, showed more awareness than he'd seen in weeks. Traverse conducted his examination with professional precision despite his internal turmoil. He checked her pulse, finding it slightly stronger than before. Her breathing appeared less labored. Her skin, while still far too pale, had lost some of its translucent quality. When he spoke to her, she responded with more clarity than she'd managed in recent weeks. The improvements were subtle but undeniable. His journal wrestles with the implications across several pages. Medical ethics demanded he report what Samuel was doing. Professional standards required he stop this barbaric practice immediately. Yet he'd just examined a patient who appeared marginally better than when the treatment began. Not recovered, not even close to healthy, but improved when every conventional treatment had produced only continued decline. Traverse faced the choice he'd been avoiding since their November conversation: report Samuel and guarantee Margaret's death, or maintain silence and become complicit in something no doctor should condone. He could claim ignorance, say he'd never witnessed the treatment directly, but that would be a lie, and his journal suggests lying troubled him more than the medical irregularity itself. That evening, Traverse returned to the farmhouse and told Samuel he would continue monitoring Margaret's condition weekly. He made no mention of what he'd seen in the kitchen. He offered no approval or condemnation, but his continued presence represented a tacit agreement. He wouldn't interfere as long as Margaret showed no signs of harm from the treatment. His journal entry concludes, God forgive me for what I am allowing to continue, but I cannot sentence her to certain death by stopping it. Traverse's journal entries from December 1876 through February 1877 document a physician watching something that shouldn't be possible. Each weekly visit brought observations that contradicted his medical training. Yet the evidence accumulated in ways he couldn't dismiss as coincidence or wishful thinking. His December 9th examination noted Margaret's pulse had strengthened noticeably. Not normal, he emphasized in his notes, but measurably improved from the barely detectable thread he'd found in October. Her heart rate had stabilized. When he pressed his fingers to her wrist, he could feel regular beats without straining to detect them. Such improvement seemed impossible in a patient he'd considered beyond recovery just weeks earlier. The visits became exercises in professional cognitive dissonance. Traverse would arrive expecting to find Margaret unchanged or worse, fitting his understanding of her condition's natural progression. Instead, he documented incremental improvements that accumulated week by week. Her skin tone gradually shifted from death, pale toward merely pale. Her breathing required less visible effort. The period she remained conscious lengthened from hours to most of the day. His journal reveals the internal conflict this created. He'd spent years studying medicine, building his practice on established knowledge and proven treatments. Now he watched a patient recovering through a method that violated everything he'd been taught. The scientific part of his mind rejected the correlation between Samuel's treatment and Margaret's improvement. The clinical observer in him couldn't deny what he was documenting. By Christmas, Margaret could sit upright in bed without assistance for extended periods. Traverse noted this milestone with careful precision, measuring how long she maintained the position before exhaustion set in. 30 minutes during his Christmas Eve visit, an hour by New Year's Day. These weren't dramatic recoveries, but they represented progress where only decline had seemed possible. Samuel's diary from this period shows his own cautious optimism, tempered by fear of reversal. He continued the twice-daily regimen without variation, treating it like a sacred ritual that couldn't be disrupted. His entries record Margaret's gradual return to awareness, her increasing ability to hold their son, brief conversations they managed as her strength returned. He wrote about hope for the first time since August, though always qualified with uncertainty about whether the improvement would last. January brought more measurable changes. Traverse's examination on January 7th found Margaret's body temperature had risen to near normal levels. The dangerous coldness that had characterized her condition through autumn had resolved. Her color continued improving. When he checked her nail beds, they showed pink rather than the deathly white he'd seen for months. These physical signs suggested her body was somehow rebuilding what had been lost. The doctor faced an impossible professional situation. He was observing a recovery he couldn't explain using conventional medical understanding. If he wrote about it in medical journals, he'd have to describe the treatment Samuel was using. That would end his career and likely result in Samuel's prosecution. If he remained silent, he denied the medical community knowledge of potential treatment for severe anemia, however unorthodox. His journal shows him choosing silence, but the decision clearly tormented him. He wrote lengthy passages analyzing Margaret's recovery, trying to find alternative explanations. Perhaps her body had simply needed more time to regenerate naturally. Perhaps the iron supplements had finally accumulated enough to make a difference. Perhaps spontaneous recovery from such severe blood loss was rarer than medical literature suggested, but not impossible. But his clinical honesty wouldn't let him fully embrace these rationalizations. He'd seen too many anemia cases in his career to believe Margaret's recovery was coincidental timing. Something about Samuel's treatment was working, even if Traverse couldn't bring himself to write that conclusion explicitly in his professional notes. By late January, Margaret could stand with assistance, walk a few steps before needing to rest, feed herself without help, hold her son for extended periods. These weren't the abilities of a dying woman. They were the abilities of someone slowly returning to life. Traverse's February 3rd entry concludes with a statement that captures his bewilderment. I am watching a medical impossibility unfold before me, and I have no framework to understand it. Margaret Burchard should not be alive. Yet she improves each week. I document what I observe, but I cannot explain what it means. Samuel's diary entry from February 14, 1877, marks exactly 1 year since his wedding day. The contrast he describes between that February and this one fills several pages written in a hand that shakes slightly, as if emotion made steady writing difficult. A year earlier, he'd married a healthy young woman full of hope. 6 months ago, he'd watched her dying while doctors offered nothing. Now she sat in a chair by the bedroom window holding their son, speaking in full sentences. The transformation accelerated through February and into March. Traverse's clinical notes document abilities returning in sequence, like watching someone emerge from a long illness. Margaret could walk across the bedroom without assistance, then down the stairs one careful step at a time, then through the house, pausing to rest but managing the distance. Each milestone seemed minor in isolation but represented profound recovery for someone who'd been unable to lift her head from a pillow 3 months earlier. Her appetite returned gradually. Samuel's diary describes meals she could finally consume and keep down: bread with butter, boiled eggs, vegetable soup. Simple foods, but her body accepted them where it had rejected everything during the worst months. She began regaining the weight she'd lost, her face filling out, her arms losing their skeletal appearance. The physical signs of starvation reversed week by week. Traverse noted changes in her mental state as well. The fog that had characterized her consciousness through autumn and early winter lifted. She engaged in conversations, remembered recent events, expressed interest in household matters she'd been too weak to care about. Her mind was recovering alongside her body, suggesting the treatment was addressing more than just physical depletion. By mid-February, Samuel began reducing the frequency of treatments. His diary shows him moving from twice daily to once daily, watching carefully for any sign of decline. Margaret maintained her improvement. After 2 weeks with no setback, he reduced to every other day. Still, she continued strengthening. The dependency on the treatment appeared to be lessening as her body regained its own capacity for recovery. Traverse's March 5th examination found Margaret's vital signs approaching normal ranges. Her pulse was strong and regular. Her color had improved to the point where casual observers wouldn't immediately identify her as someone who'd been gravely ill. Her strength allowed her to move through the house freely, to care for her son, to resume light household tasks. She still tired more easily than before her pregnancy, but fatigue was manageable rather than debilitating. The doctor faced an awkward professional reality. Margaret had recovered from a condition he'd declared fatal. She'd survived when every medical principle suggested she couldn't, and she'd done so through a treatment he could never officially acknowledge. His notes from March carefully document her improved state, while avoiding any mention of how that improvement occurred. The clinical record shows recovery without explaining the mechanism. Samuel's diary from late March records his decision to stop the treatments entirely. Margaret had been receiving them only twice weekly by then, and even those seemed more precautionary than necessary. On March 23rd, he administered what would be the final treatment, then wrote a single sentence. "I believe we are finished with this dark necessity." The following days brought no decline. Margaret continued her activities without the supplementation. Her body had apparently regained whatever capacity it needed to maintain itself. The crisis had passed. The desperate measure that had saved her life was no longer required. Traverse's final house call as Margaret's attending physician took place on March 30th. His examination found her essentially recovered, still weaker than she'd been before childbirth, but functional and continuing to improve. He declared her out of medical danger, noting in his official record that she'd survived severe postpartum complications through extended rest and supportive care. The lie by omission sat in his files alongside his private journal, two versions of the same story existing side by side. Before leaving, Traverse spoke privately with Samuel in the parlor. His journal records what he said: that Margaret's recovery was remarkable, that she should continue building strength gradually, that he saw no reason she couldn't resume normal life within a few months. He made no mention of the treatment that had saved her. Neither did Samuel. They'd reached an unspoken agreement that some knowledge was better left undocumented. Dr. Traverse's journal continued for another 32 years after Margaret's recovery, filling 6 more volumes housed alongside the first at the Rutland County Historical Society. Thousands of patient cases fill those pages: broken bones, fevers, infections, childbirths, deaths. Nowhere in those 3 decades of medical practice does he mention the Burchard case again. The silence speaks louder than any written words could. No article bearing Traverse's name appears in medical journals from the period. Researchers have searched archives of the New England Journal of Medicine, the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, and smaller regional publications. His publishing record remains blank. For a physician who kept such meticulous records, who clearly possessed the writing skills and analytical mind for medical literature, the absence suggests deliberate choice rather than lack of opportunity. His personal correspondence, preserved in family papers, includes letters from colleagues discussing various medical cases and seeking his opinion on treatment approaches. None of these letters mentioned severe anemia or unconventional treatments. Either his fellow physicians never asked, or he never shared what he'd witnessed. The latter seems more likely given Traverse's reputation for careful professional boundaries. The medical establishment of 1870s New England operated within strict social and ethical frameworks. Physicians who violated accepted standards faced professional censure, loss of licenses, public scandal. Traverse would have understood that revealing Samuel's treatment method would destroy multiple lives. His own career, Samuel's reputation, Margaret's dignity, their family's standing in the community. The cost of truth exceeded any benefit it might bring. Margaret and Samuel's subsequent lives appear in public records with remarkable normality. Census data from 1880 shows them still farming the same 60 acres, now with 2 children. The 1890 census lists 4 children. Tax records indicate steady property improvements. A new barn in 1882. Additional land purchase in 1887. They were prospering, building the life that had nearly ended in that terrible autumn of 1876. Margaret lived to age 63, dying in 1921 of pneumonia according to her death certificate. No mention of her earlier medical crisis appears in the official record. Samuel survived her by 4 years, passing in 1925 at age 71. Their children grew to adulthood, married, had families of their own. The bloodline continued through descendants who never knew the desperate measure that had preserved it. Local newspapers from the period carry no hints of scandal or unusual medical cases. The Rutland Herald's archives show standard coverage of the Burchard family. Property transactions, church activities, obituaries for extended family members. If neighbors suspected anything irregular about Margaret's recovery, they left no public record of those suspicions. Rural communities could keep secrets when they chose to. The 3 principals in the story took their knowledge to the grave. Traverse died in 1908, his obituary praising his dedication to rural medicine and his service to the community. Samuel's 1925 obituary described him as a respected farmer and devoted husband. Margaret's 1921 death notice mentioned her survival of 5 children to adulthood and her active role in the Methodist Church. None acknowledged what had occurred in that farmhouse during the winter of 1876 and 77. The only evidence exists in documents, none of them intended for public view. Samuel's diary and unsent letters remained in family storage for decades after his death. Traverse's private journal sat unexamined in the Historical Society until Dorothy Keene opened it in 1923. The truth survived not through any desire to share it, but through the accident of careful record, keeping and eventual archival preservation. Professional medical literature from the 1880s and 90s shows growing understanding of anemia and its treatments. Physicians published studies on iron supplementation, dietary interventions, and eventually primitive blood transfusion techniques. None cite cases resembling Margaret's. The knowledge that might have advanced medical understanding remained locked in silence, deemed too dangerous to share despite its apparent effectiveness. 3 people knew what had saved Margaret Burchard's life. All 3 chose permanent silence over professional recognition, medical advancement, or historical documentation. The decision reflects the moral complexity of their situation. They'd crossed boundaries that couldn't be publicly acknowledged regardless of the outcome. Modern hematology offers explanations that 1870s physicians couldn't have imagined. Dr. Patricia Drummond, a specialist in blood disorders at Johns Hopkins, examined photocopies of Traverse's journal in 1998 as part of a research project on historical medical cases. Her analysis, published in the Journal of Medical History, provides scientific context for what Samuel accidentally discovered through desperation. Severe postpartum hemorrhage causes profound anemia by depleting not just blood volume, but the body's iron stores and protein reserves needed to manufacture new blood cells. Margaret's body had lost the raw materials for recovery. 1870s treatments like iron supplements and beef tea provided these nutrients in forms her compromised digestive system couldn't efficiently process. The supplements passed through without adequate absorption. Fresh blood consumed orally provides iron in heme form, bound to protein molecules that the digestive system can break down and absorb far more readily than ferrous sulfate tablets. It also delivers complete proteins, vitamins, and other nutrients in bioavailable forms. Drummond's analysis suggests Margaret's body was able to extract and utilize these elements in ways that conventional treatments couldn't provide. The twice-daily small doses Samuel administered likely fell within a range the digestive system could handle without adverse reactions. Larger amounts might have caused nausea or other complications. The gradual approach allowed Margaret's recovering body to process the nutrients steadily, rebuilding her blood supply incrementally. Samuel had accidentally discovered an effective dosing schedule through caution rather than scientific knowledge. The wine mixture served purposes beyond masking taste. Alcohol can enhance iron absorption in the digestive tract. The tannins in red wine contain compounds that, in moderate amounts, support healthy blood cell production. While Samuel couldn't have known these biochemical details, his instinctive choice of wine as a delivery mechanism may have improved the treatment's effectiveness. Drummond's paper notes that similar practices appeared sporadically throughout medical history, usually in desperate circumstances where conventional treatments had failed. A handful of documented cases from remote regions show patients recovering from severe anemia through oral blood consumption. These incidents remained isolated, never studied systematically, always surrounded by social taboo that prevented open discussion. The treatment worked not through any mystical property of blood, but through basic nutritional biochemistry that wouldn't be fully understood for another 70 years. Samuel and Margaret stumbled onto a delivery method for essential nutrients that her body desperately needed in forms it could actually use. The timing proved crucial. Had he waited another few weeks, Margaret might have weakened beyond the point where any intervention could help. Modern medicine achieves similar results through blood transfusion, iron infusions, and nutritional supplementation delivered in controlled medical settings. These methods are safer, more efficient, and don't require the psychological burden Samuel and Margaret carried. But in 1876, rural Vermont, none of those options existed. Samuel worked with the only resources available, his own body and his wife's desperate need. Drummond's analysis concludes that Margaret's recovery, while unusual in method, follows logical medical principles. Her body needed specific nutrients in bioavailable forms. The treatment provided those nutrients. Given sufficient time and consistent delivery, her system gradually rebuilt what had been lost. The mechanism was sound, even if the approach was unorthodox. The case raises uncomfortable questions about how medical knowledge advances. Sometimes desperate circumstances drive innovations that formal research would never attempt. Sometimes breakthroughs occur through accidents and intuition rather than systematic study. And sometimes the most effective treatments remain hidden because social boundaries prevent their discussion. Traverse's journal sits in its archival box, a testament to medical improvisation born from impossible choices. Samuel's diary rests nearby, documenting a husband's desperate gamble. Margaret's recovery stands as evidence that sometimes survival requires crossing boundaries that can never be publicly acknowledged. 3 lives intersected in that Vermont farmhouse during one terrible winter, and all 3 chose silence over revelation. The story survived not because anyone wanted it told, but because honest documentation outlasted the people who created it. And perhaps that's how it should be. Some truths are too disturbing to celebrate, even when they save lives. If this story left you as shaken as it should, Hit that like button, subscribe, because we're just getting started uncovering the medical nightmares history tried to bury. The next case makes this one look tame.